Welcome back. It's so great to see so many of you, particularly students in my class who I don't ever really get to know beyond the regular class sessions. Please make yourselves comfortable. And remember, this is the 9th annual Southeast Philosophy Congress hosted here at Clayton State. Our department's always glad to host this. And remember, those of you who are Clayton State students, that we do have an active philosophy major. You can talk to any of the faculty in our department about our major, and these kinds of discussions, you could say that they kind of go on nonstop. Okay? We're delighted to have as our keynote speaker this afternoon Dr. Andrew Altman from Georgia State University. Dr. Altman is Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy at GSU. He's authored Critical Legal Studies, a Liberal Critique, also Arguing About Law, an Introduction to Legal Philosophy, as well as A Liberal Theory of International Justice, which he co-authored with Christopher Wellman. Dr. Altman received his PhD from Columbia University in philosophy, and before coming to Georgia State, he taught at George Washington University, also at Bowling Green State University. Today, Dr. Altman is going to talk on targeting terrorists and distributing risks, a very relevant issue today. So without further ado, let me give the floor over to Dr. Altman. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for coming out on a beautiful and relatively warm late winter afternoon in Georgia, and I thank Dr. Lau and his colleagues here at Clayton State Philosophy Department for inviting me to speak with you. My topic this afternoon is the counter-terrorist tactic known as targeted killing. In the years since 9/11, this tactic has been the subject of considerable public debate and discussion. Advocates of targeted killing as a counter-terrorist tactic argue that it is effective in preventing terrorist attacks, and they consider the tactic to be consistent with morality and compatible with the applicable rules of international law. Critics of targeted killing argue that it is counterproductive because it creates more terrorists than it kills, and the critics also contend that the tactic is immoral and incompatible with international law. So in my talk today, I want to focus on international law and ask the question, is there some set of legal rules for regulating targeted killing that no state could reasonably reject? And I'm going to argue that there are reasons for thinking that there is no such set of legal rules, that any set of legal rules that one state might reasonably endorse, another state could reasonably reject. So to set up my analysis, I think it's helpful to imagine a kind of spectrum or scale on which various legal rules regarding targeted killing can be arrayed. So here's my scale, and at the two extremes we find the rule, which nobody really endorses, but just for conceptual purposes it's helpful to make reference to it. The rule, no targeted killing ever under any condition. Okay, so that would be the extreme version of the most restrictive rule. Okay, at the opposite end of the spectrum would be the most permissive rule, which would say something like targeted killing whenever a state deems it advisable. Okay? And again, nobody really advocates the targeted killing whenever rule, but keeping it in mind, I think, can help us set the parameters or the framework for the debate. I think it's fairly clear that each of these rules can be reasonably rejected by at least some states, and indeed probably all states. So the no targeted killing ever rule could be reasonably rejected by states that judge their citizens to be under threat from terrorist attack and reasonably regard targeted killing as helpful in at least some instances to prevent the attack. So those states could reasonably reject no targeted killing ever as unduly restrictive and insufficiently protective of the lives of their citizens. At the other end of the spectrum, states can reasonably reject the targeted killing whenever a state judges it to be advisable, a rule, because a state may think that other states will conduct targeted killing operations on its territory, that is, on the territory of the initial states, and they don't want other states conducting targeted killings on their own territory because they think those killings pose too great a risk to their own civilians in the vicinity of the action where the targeted killing takes place. So at least as a first crack, it seems pretty clear that the two extreme rules can be reasonably rejected by some states and maybe even by all states. Okay, so my question is whether there is some set of rules or some legal arrangement in between the two extremes that no state can reasonably reject. Is there something in here that no state can reasonably say, we refuse to go along with that policy, we do not agree to it? Okay, so that's the question that I'm focusing on, and my analysis concerns international law, the rules of international law for targeted killing, the rules that are currently in force, plus any possible alternatives to those rules. Now, anticipating and simplifying my analysis a bit, okay, there are two main contenders for a rule that's not reasonably rejectable: the imminence rule and the necessity rule. Now, let me explain briefly these rules and why I indicate through the diagram here that imminence is a more restrictive rule than necessity, even though that might seem paradoxical at first glance. So, I think we have plenty of room over here, so if you want to come by, please do so. Okay, so let me begin with the imminence rule. The imminence rule, simply formulated, would be no targeted killing unless a terrorist attack is about to occur, okay, unless the attack is imminent. Now, obviously, the term imminent or about to occur is somewhat vague. Does it mean minutes? Does it mean hours? Does it mean days? That would so have to be settled by legal analysis and looking at particular cases. But whatever the precise borders of imminence, we could say an attack months out would not be imminent, and certainly an attack years out, and probably even an attack weeks out. So we're probably talking about something from either minutes to days when we're thinking about the imminence rule, and says no targeted killing unless an attack by terrorists is about to take place. Now, this is a pretty restrictive rule, okay, because it requires states to wait maybe even a long time before they take lethal action against a potential terrorist attack. And so they may know of plans for the attack. They may even know the plans have been set in motion, but under this rule, the states would have to wait in order for the attack just about to happen before they could kill the terrorists who were involved in the attack. Now, I'm going to suggest that this rule can be reasonably rejected by some states on the ground that the rule is insufficiently protective of the civilians who might be killed in the terrorist attacks directed at those states. So this rule, in other words, would be reasonably, I'm going to suggest, can be reasonably rejected by states that think it's too restrictive and insufficiently permissive. Okay. Now, the main alternative to the imminence rule is the necessity rule. The necessity rule says, as a first crack, no targeted killing unless it's necessary to prevent an attack by terrorists. Now, it may strike you that this doesn't really look that much different or certainly much more permissive. It doesn't look any more permissive than the imminence rule, right? And in fact, that would be true if necessary here were construed literally to mean it's absolutely impossible to prevent the attack unless the targeted killing is engaged in. However, okay, in the law, in many areas, not just in this, okay, terms don't always get applied and construed in a literal fashion. They're often, what one might say, are loosely understood. And in this context, necessary here is loosely understood. Understood how? It's understood roughly in the following way in practice, okay, by legal scholars who defend the rule and also by those domestic jurisdictions that have a necessity rule as part of their domestic criminal code. Okay, so what does necessary mean in practice? It means that any delay in going ahead with the targeted killing makes the probability of a successful terrorist attack too high. Okay. So this is not a literal understanding of necessary, as absolutely impossible for it to be otherwise. That's how philosophers would tend to understand necessary, at least in context regarding metaphysics or other areas of philosophy. But in the law, necessary is understood in a more flexible way. In practice, that means not it's impossible to stop the attack in any other way, but rather any delay in going ahead with the killing makes the probability of a successful attack too high. Now, notice that the reason why the necessity rule is more permissive is because necessary is not being understood literally here. It's being understood in a looser sense, while imminence is being understood literally. So under the necessity rule, even if an attack is not imminent by terrorists, targeted killing those terrorists could be permissible. Even if the attack is not imminent, could be permissible if any delay in killing the terrorist makes it too high a likelihood that they're going to succeed, right? Because we have them in our sights now, and even though the attack may not happen for a month, we have them in our sights now, and if we don't get them now, they may disappear underground, and we may not be able to locate them again before it's too late. So necessity actually is a more permissive rule than imminence because it allows the killing, it permits the killing of terrorists whose plans are not about to take place, but may take place a month out, even several months out. Okay, so that's the general lay of the land. Now, what I want to say is that just as the imminence rule can be reasonably rejected by some states as too restrictive on their ability to counter terrorism, the necessity rule can be rejected reasonably, by other states as insufficiently protective of their civilian populations, as insufficiently protective of the civilians in the strike area who might be killed as a result of incidental damage or misidentification, etc. So other states can say necessity is too permissive. We're going to reject anything that is more permissive than imminence, while some states will say, no, it's the reverse. Necessity, we need a necessity rule, and imminence is too restrictive. Anything less permissive than necessity, anything more restrictive than necessity is not permissive enough. So that's basically the outline of the argument I'm going to make. Okay, let me begin by start plunging into the details by distinguishing between two types of targeted killing, what are called in the literature personality strikes on the one side and signature strikes on the other. Right after 9/11, the Bush administration began to develop so-called kill lists. Kill lists were lists of the names of persons who were regarded, based on intelligence information, as active members of Al-Qaeda and other affiliated terrorist organizations. Personality strikes were the targeted killings of those named individuals. These individuals had been identified in advance, and their names were placed on a list, and they, at least people thought intelligence officers thought they knew who these people were, and they were subject to killing by the American administration. Now, several years later, and it's not clear exactly when this started to happen, but certainly by the time the Obama administration came along, a second kind of targeted killing was implemented called signature strikes. With signature strikes, the name and exact identity of the suspected terrorists being targeted are not known. Okay. But based on intelligence information, it's said that these individuals, in their daily patterns of activity, are doing the kinds of things that terrorists typically tend to do. What those are, don't ask me. I don't know. I mean, presumably there's some pattern of behavior that's indicative of being involved in a terrorist scheme. And that pattern of behavior was taken as a kind of a badge labeling these individuals as engaged in terrorist activities. And so they were made subject to targeted killings based on that, even though we didn't have their names. That is to say, the intelligence agencies didn't have their names or know exactly who they were. Now, let me turn briefly to the very contentious question, what is terrorism? The term is problematic, and I don't want to downplay how problematic it is. Although the term appears in a large number of international legal agreements, there's no canonical definition of the term terrorism. There's not even any consensus among legal scholars what terrorism means. So, for example, one common source of disagreement is the question of whether states can engage in terrorism, as that term is understood under international law. And some scholars say no, some scholars say yes. U.S. law defines terrorism in a way that restricts terrorism to non-state groups, such as Al-Qaeda, or in fact even ISIS and the Taliban, at least the Taliban before they controlled Afghanistan and after they were kicked out. Now, you can simply stipulate that states can't be engaged in terrorism. Fine. And that's what U.S. law does, and it's very convenient for U.S. law to do that because that means then the U.S. cannot possibly engage in terrorism as its law defines it. But even more troubling than that, the term terrorism is routinely abused by politicians, law enforcement agencies like the FBI, and people in the public eye who simply want to place an especially intense stigma on a certain group or a certain political position. So various pro-ecology groups have been labeled terrorist groups by the FBI, even though these groups do not aim to cause any harm to civilians. So the term does get abused. Now, have philosophers been able to straighten out the mess in defining terrorism? And the answer is no. Philosophers have not been able to straighten out this mess. Philosophers disagree probably almost as much as anybody else in defining terrorism. And one of the key points of disagreement concerns whether terrorism requires the intentional killing of a human being, or whether simply negligent or reckless killing could count as terrorism. Now, I think that's not an easy question to answer, but I want to circumvent that question and adopt a simpler route. I think that it's not possible to realistically avoid talking about terrorism. The term is just too entrenched in law and public discourse. So we have to use the term in some way. I suggest that we think of prototypical cases, cases that any sensible and well-informed person would easily identify as terrorism, and specify some of the features of those kinds of cases and say that's roughly what we're talking about. If some instance deviates from that prototype, then we'll have to discuss in more detail whether it's terrorism or not. But let's stick with the prototypical cases and their features. And here are some features that I would include as prototypical features of terrorism. It's intentional violence aimed at civilians, reasonably calculated to cause death or grave bodily harm, and widespread alarm among the civilian population, and motivated by political goals. Okay, I'd say that's a prototypical case of terrorism. So it's got to be intentional violence, not just accidental or careless. Intentional, aimed at civilians, reasonably calculated to cause death or grave bodily harm. So if I shoot a water gun at you intending to kill you, that's not terrorism. Water gun is not reasonably calculated. Reasonably calculated to cause widespread alarm in the civilian population and motivated by political goals or values. Okay. Now, the question I'm focused on is whether there's some rule between no targeted killing ever and targeted killing whenever that no state can reasonably reject. But what do I mean by reasonable rejection? Well, here I borrow from the philosopher Thomas Scanlon, who's used the idea of reasonable rejection in developing a theory of the moral duties that we owe one another. And I don't want to develop a theory of moral duties here, so I'm not doing exactly what Scanlon did, but I think he says a few things about reasonable rejectability that are useful for my purposes. So one point he makes about reasonable rejectability is that it is a value-laden notion. Okay? In other words, certain values are going to come into the judgment of whether some legal rule has been reasonably rejected. Those values will include the well-being of humans, but also include things like rights and obligations and considerations of fairness. So there's no mechanical procedure for determining what counts as reasonably rejectable or not. You've got to make a value judgment. And of course, that's going to mean that people's judgments are going to differ somewhat depending upon their background value considerations. I think that Scanlon is exactly, that part of Scanlon is something that I take on board fully. But I do want to emphasize that the question that I am asking is not the question of what rules of international law would be morally ideal. Okay? I'm not asking a question about the moral ideal here. For example, it's perfectly possible that the moral ideal of international law would completely outlaw armed conflict under any conditions, that it would be a kind of a pacifist international law. And indeed, some of my colleagues in philosophy and international legal theory have argued that it would be best to have a pacifism embodied in international law so that war was never permitted. I think that is might be right. But I don't think it's reasonable now to expect states to adopt a pacifistic view. I think they could reasonably reject a pacifist rule on the ground, at least some states, on the ground that it would leave them unduly open to attacks by non-state actors or bad state actors who really didn't care at all about what international law has to say. So although the moral ideal may be no armed conflict at all, the reality is, as I see it, that it's not something that we could reasonably demand of all states, at least at this point in human history. Okay, now, if we turn to international law, we find that there are two main parts of international law that are relevant to the targeted killing debate. Okay? International humanitarian law, often abbreviated as IHL, or just humanitarian law on the one side, and the law of national self-defense on the other. So let me first say a few words about international humanitarian law. Okay? This has nothing to do with food shipments to Syrian refugees. Okay? International humanitarian law is the set of rules that regulate armed conflict and what is permissible and obligatory within an armed conflict. Okay, that's international humanitarian law. It's essentially the set of rules governing armed conflict and what's permissible and obligatory within armed conflict. Now, there are two important rules for our purposes. One is what's called the principle of distinction, which says in armed conflict, it's absolutely impermissible to target civilians. So distinction means there's a distinction between combatants and civilians are off limits. Okay, civilians are off limits. So it's impermissible absolutely to target civilians. The second principle is a principle of proportionality, a principle concerning what counts as excessive or not excessive. And the second principle of humanitarian law says that a military attack that incidentally kills civilians that is a military attack. We're talking about international humanitarian law now, as it might apply to targeted killing. So, so proportionality principle says a military attack that incidentally kills civilians, that is, they're killed as a side effect, not as an intention of the attack, is permissible as long as the damage to civilians is, quote, not excessive in relation to the military advantage anticipated by the attack. Okay. So, so under international law, the United States could attack, let's say, Iraqi soldiers in the first Gulf War and have civilians killed as a side effect as long as the civilian deaths was not excessive. Now, what counts as excessive? This is largely left up to commanders on the field. So there's a wide discretion here in determining what's excessive and what's not excessive. But for my purposes, more important is that in order to be not excessive, an attack doesn't have to save lots of civilians on your side. An attack might not save any civilians on your side, but just bring the war to an end a day earlier on terms that are economically and politically more favorable to your side. So you're allowed to kill, you're allowed to incidentally kill, let's say, 10 civilians on the other side, in order to bring the war to an end sooner on terms that are more favorable economically to your country. And that would not be excessive. Okay. So what I want to highlight here is that humanitarian law licenses states to give the lives of their own civilians more weight than the lives of the civilians of other states. Okay, that's really the key point that I'm trying to make here. Now, some scholars take the view that when it comes to meeting terrorist threats, these rules of distinction and proportionality of IHL apply. In other words, we are at war with terrorists, as the saying goes. So the terrorists are our enemy. We can intentionally kill enemy combatants, and we can even incidentally kill a fair number of civilians in our attacks because that's how war works. And so there's generally sort of no problem. But I reject that analysis. I think that analysis is questionable because I think that except for a few cases, the U.S. Or Israel, or as it now comes to be, Britain and maybe France, are addressing terrorist threats in a way that it stretches matters to say that the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law applies. And the reason I say that is that armed conflict, like other legal terms, has a specific technical meaning. Okay? Not just any military skirmish between whoever counts as an armed conflict to which IHL applies. Certain conditions have to be met. And one of the conditions is that both sides in the conflict need to be capable of sustained military operations. Now, ISIS is certainly capable of sustained military operations. And the Taliban are certainly capable of sustained military operations. But Al-Qaeda and most of its affiliates are not. They just don't have the resources. Their operations are sporadic. A bomb here, a bomb there, an attack here, an attack there, with long periods of quiescence in between. That's not sustained military operations. And so I think it is a stretch to believe that one can justify, one can fold targeted killing under humanitarian law. I think what we need instead is to look at targeted killing for the most part in terms of the law of national self-defense. Now, as I say, I make an exception for attacks on ISIS. That's a different story. But for Al-Qaeda and many other terrorist organizations, it's going to have to be the law of self-defense which applies to the targeted killings. Now, many scholars who reject the war model say, yes, the law of national self-defense is what applies here, and the existing law of national self-defense is a rule of imminence, or at least includes a rule of imminence. No targeted killing unless the terrorist attack is about to occur. And these days, that's probably the consensus view. Not every international lawyer holds that imminence is part of the law of self-defense in international law, but I think that's the consensus view, and I'm willing to go along with the consensus view, although I have some doubts about it. My question is whether the imminence rule could be reasonably rejected. Okay. And even if it's part of international law, could it be reasonably rejected by a state like the United States or some other state? And I say yes. Okay? It can be reasonably rejected. So, why? Well, consider the following. Imagine that the following is true. I don't know that it's true because I don't have access. I have top security clearance. But based on the data that's in the public domain, I think the following is not implausible. Suppose that there are 500 separate terrorist plans against the United States every year. Okay, suppose there are 500 of them from all terrorist groups in the. Okay, suppose that by not using targeting killing at all, we can stop or prevent 95% of them. So just using regular law enforcement, we could stop 95%. Okay, that would still leave 25 attacks that could not be stopped by law enforcement means. Okay, so is targeted killing going to be acceptable in those situations? Well, the imminence requirement says, well, for those 25 that you can't stop by law enforcement means, each year, you're going to have to wait until those attacks are about to take place. So even if you have the terrorists in your gun sights 3 weeks before, you've got to wait till the day before or maybe 2 days before. But the problem with delaying, once you have the terrorists in your gun sight, is that you may not get the terrorists back in your gun sight again. Right? They may disappear as terrorists are wont to do. That's their job, as it were, to disappear. So I think the United States could reasonably reject the imminence rule as too restrictive. It's too restrictive. Okay? And so it does not sufficiently allow the U.S. to protect its own civilian population. So what rule could we have instead? Well, the necessity rule. And in fact, I think this is the actual rule that the Obama administration is trying to follow. I think the CIA is got to be dragged along kicking and screaming with this because they basically want the targeted killing whenever rule. Okay, but I think Obama is trying to get the U.S. government to follow a necessity rule, a rule that says that once you have the terrorists in the gun sight, any delay in killing them makes the probability of a successful terrorist attack too high. There's too good a chance that they may disappear and be able to conduct the attack. I think that is what Obama, even though he says he's talking about imminence, I think he's really talking about necessity. Now, could other states reject the necessity rule as unreasonably permissive? I think yes. Okay? Namely, the states on whose territory the targeted killings would occur can reasonably object to the necessity rule as too permissive and insufficiently protective of their civilians who might be misidentified by intelligence organizations, or who might be just bystanders in the area and blown up when the terrorists are blown up. So I think reasonable rejectability applies both to necessity and imminence. The U.S. could reject imminence as too restrictive. Other countries could reject necessity as too permissive. Okay? And although I can't prove it, I suspect it's going to be very hard to find some middle ground rule that cannot be reasonably rejected. Now, I have some ideas in mind for what might be in the middle ground, but my sense is that that middle ground rule is more likely, if it's to be agreed to as a matter of international law, it will be because of a kind of a compromise. So the U.S. will say, okay, we could reasonably reject this rule and promote necessity and insist on necessity, but we'll compromise. Or countries that can reasonably reject necessity might compromise on something more permissive than imminence. And if that happens, then I certainly won't object to it. But I think that such a middle ground rule, a kind of sort of a Goldilocks rule that hits the exact balance between imminence and necessity, is one that's very hard to formulate, and it may not actually exist. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to take questions. Yeah, Sunday?
Do you see any viable prospects for getting past this, you could say, tribalism, where countries will always say our citizens should come first, our civilians should come first? It seems like that's kind of a stumbling block for having a law that everyone could agree on. If somehow we could say, all lives matter equally that are civilians, maybe we could get around some of these problems. Do you think that that's viable?
I think we would get around many of these problems if states could be persuaded to sign on to a system in which all lives counted equally. But I regard that as a moral ideal, and probably even a moral ideal further off than just the pacifism rule. Because notice, if all lives really counted equally, and so states were prohibited from favoring their own citizens or showing any partiality to their own citizens, that would mean, it would seem to me, for example, that the wealthier nations would be obligated to support social insurance programs in the poorer nations. The wealthier nations couldn't just say, we're going to have retirement insurance, we're going to have unemployment insurance and retirement plans and national health care in our countries, and you countries that are too poor for it, well, too bad on you, because millions of people are dying every year, maybe even every day, because of the lack of health care and other things. So the wealthier countries would be required to fund very major social programs in the poorer countries, and that is a marked departure from anything that is currently on the table now, even among pretty far-sighted international law scholars. So I think it's that moral ideal would solve a lot of the problems, but it's a long way off. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Could we save the imminence rule if we got into the definition of imminence and maybe added some sort of robust measurement based on, say, the type of attack? Like if we knew that a terror cell had, 5 or 6 people and they were trying to I don't know, destroy the Hoover Dam. And we think, okay, well, 5 or 6 people trying to blow up the Hoover Dam is going to take months and months and months, as opposed to, one person just going off and just setting off a bomb somewhere. Do you think that's a viable route or more problematic?
I think for the defenders of imminence, it doesn't really make a difference as to how long the plan is under development.
Okay.
It could be like that, or it could be years in the making. Okay. What matters is whether the attack is about to take place, whatever the backstory leading up to the attack. Okay. Whereas for necessity, it matters a lot what the backstory is, because depending on how long the plan is in the making, if you have a plan that is 3 years in the making, and in year 1 you have the folks in your gun sights, well, that seems to be premature. You don't really need to take the person out at that point. You've got plenty of other time to try to arrest them, to try to disrupt their plans in other ways. So I think the story about how long the terrorist plan is in the making is relevant to the necessity rule, but not to the imminence rule. Yeah.
With the application of the international humanitarian law and putting the necessity rule underneath that, where we have to have distinction and proportionality, doesn't that make it more restrictive to where it's closer to the middle, and couldn't that be considered reasonable?
Okay. International humanitarian law is actually quite permissive. So it would be down here. It would be more permissive than necessity. Why? Because the necessity rule, okay, is saying that essentially that you're looking at lives saved, and you're saying, in order to save lives on our side, we've got to kill those terrorists, and so we've got to kill those terrorists, okay, to save lives on our side. For international humanitarian law, you can kill your enemy without having to save lives on your side. Saving lives on your side can be completely irrelevant to it. So saving money on your side, at least money that would go into the military, is a permissible military objective that gets weighed against civilian lives lost. So under both the necessity rule and the IHL rule, targeting civilians is off the table. Targeting enemy combatants is okay. But under the IHL rule, damage to civilians is okay for reasons that are strictly military reasons and don't necessarily have anything to do with the folks on your saving the lives of the folks on your side. And that's why IHL is much more permissive, and that's why this is why the more aggressive members of the Bush administration kept arguing that IHL is what applies in the fight against al-Qaeda, because IHL gave the most permissive rules for combating the enemy and allowed the most collateral damage in fighting the enemy, the most incidental killing of civilians in fighting the enemy, whereas the necessity rule, and this is a part of it that I didn't go into that I didn't really go into, but the necessity rule does say that one can't say the killing is necessary to save money or to avoid further military expenditures or bring about a more politically favorable peace treaty. That is not allowed on the necessity rule. It's necessary in order to prevent the attack from killing these civilians.
So my question is, in the United States,
Right.
it seems we go back and forth between the two. Because with the imminency, isn't that what we did with Saddam Hussein when we had him in our sights and then we said, let's wait? And now with ISIS, we're saying it's a necessity that we strike now. We got this hit list. And then with the whole big Apple thing that's going on now, with the telephones, with the privacy issue, I mean, how does that fit into all of this?
Well, I mean, the first time we had Saddam, first time we had bin Laden in our sights was under Clinton, and he said, let's wait. And it's not clear to me why he said, let's wait. I don't think he was necessarily saying, let's wait until the attack comes closer. I think he may have been saying, let's wait, maybe because there would be too many civilians in the area killed. That's possible. But the second time bin Laden was in our sights was after 9/11 and the Bush administration, and then he disappeared, not because we said let's wait, but because there was some kind of delay or confusion in the Bush administration about how to proceed or exactly when and how to proceed. And then when the Obama administration did finally kill him with SEAL Team 6, there was no imminent attack. Al-Qaeda was basically quiescent as far as attacks on the U.S. go, and bin Laden was just in his condominium in Pakistan, and he wasn't an imminent threat at that time. So this is one of the reasons why I think that Obama is really using a necessity rule rather than an imminence rule. It may indeed have been true at one point before 9/11 that American officials at least would have said we're using imminence. But after 9/11, Bush essentially gave up on the imminence and said, I'm not going to follow imminence any longer. Some of his people talked about a reinterpretation of imminence to make it longer. Okay? And so some scholars talk about elongated imminence. But that seems to me to be stretching things, as it were. It seems to me that you should try to figure out, the administration should try to figure out what rule does it want. Does it want imminence, literally understood, or does it want something else? And it seems to me that, at least at this point in American history, the U.S. government is going to want something else, no matter who is going to be president. It's going to be something else. If not necessity, then maybe something even more permissive than necessity, like international humanitarian law. Questions? Comments? Yeah.
Would you say that the law of national defense kind of illustrates a lot of the political stuff that's going on right now, bomb them until the sand glows kind of thing? Is that what's being leveraged in the American political scene right now? Is this emotionally based protectionism?
I think it's a combination of national defense and war. Okay. The law, international lawyers don't like to talk about the law of war anymore. In fact, war is a disfavored term these days with international lawyers. They like to talk about armed conflict and international humanitarian law. That seems sort of less brutal than war. But it comes to the same thing, the law of war. This is the law of war. This is the law of self-defense. And I think it's a combination of the two, because I would anticipate that any Republican who might enter the White House next January is going to be talking a lot about war on the terrorists, a lot more. Even though Obama has talked about war, I think any Republican is going to talk a lot more about it, and also a lot more about how the terrorists threaten our national defense.
Pushing that down to more permissive.
trying to push things down to get as permissive as possible, and probably in practice to whenever. Okay. The problem with whenever is that although certain U.S. officials may be very happy with the U.S. being able to carry out targeted killing whenever, they're not going to be happy with that as a general rule of international law, so that other countries could carry out targeted killings in the United States whenever they want to do it. So I think that indicates that's a reflection of the unreasonableness of the whenever rule. States would really endorse it only if they get to be the only ones to operate under that rule. Yeah.
So I have a question about, so you said that the states fighting terrorism could endorse the necessity rule reasonably, but the states who, on whose soil terrorism is being fought could reasonably reject the necessity rule. Do you think that they could come to some sort of agreement in terms of the level of probability that, so maybe if there's a 50% probability that delaying would lead to a terrorist, maybe that's too low, but is there some sort of higher boundary that states could reasonably agree on?
I'd be surprised, but I do want to point out the following qualification and complication raised by your question. Some of the states on whose territory terrorism is being fought are also states where terrorism is taking a toll. Okay? So Pakistan has a humongous number of terrorist incidents on it. And it is also a territory where targeted killing by U.S. forces is being conducted. So those states are in a complicated position, okay? Because on the one hand, they may want to invite a country like the U.S. that has intelligence resources and military resources that it lacks, invite it to fight against terrorists who are operating on Pakistani territory. But because those terrorists threaten not only Americans, they threaten the citizens of Pakistan, and have killed a far greater number of citizens of Pakistan than have ever been killed in the United States, including 9/11. So countries like Pakistan or Yemen before it fell apart was another case, are countries that need to make a complicated judgment. And the way Pakistan has done it, to my understanding, involves a little bit of cheating. I mean, not to say the United States hasn't cheated in this matter, but basically they've invited the United States, secretly, by and large, to attack certain terrorist organizations which they don't like, but are perfectly happy to give shelter to other terrorist organizations. And indeed, bin Laden, was protected by the Pakistani military when he was living in his condo. I mean, they could have easily arrested him themselves, but they were protecting him. So there's this complicated balance that the countries have to make. And I would only say that it seems to me plausible to believe that in the case of some countries, okay, where terrorist plots are being hatched and counter-terrorist attacks are being made by the U.S. and other countries, in the case of some of those countries, it would be reasonable for them to want to be able to invite a country like the U.S. in to conduct targeted killings to help protect its civilians, because it judges on balance that its civilians will be better off if the U.S. comes in and takes care of the terrorists. But I think when it does that, it can't kind of pick and choose which terrorists it likes and which it doesn't like. Yeah.
What about, so you talked about the countries that have terrorists in them or terrorist activity in them. What about countries like countries in the European Union or the Soviet or those countries, what are their stances on America's permissive policies versus restrictive?
The Europeans are pretty consistently in favor of imminence and against anything more permissive. Okay, and so because the Europeans, by and large, at least up to now, have thought that the most reasonable counterterrorist strategies involve law enforcement techniques, such as investigation and arrest and trial after charges, that kind of typical domestic law process, rather than killing, targeted killing. The general view in Europe, well, certainly not the widespread, but at least the general view among the elites in Europe, that is the government and the intellectual elites in Europe, is that targeted killing is essentially a form of summary execution. Essentially, you're taking somebody and you're executing them without a trial. They don't have any chance to defend themselves, to say, you know, I'm not the guy, you've misidentified me. So they view it as a kind of summary execution, and so they want to have the highly restrictive rules on targeted killing. They realize that in the case of an imminent attack, an attack that's about to occur, so that any delay would mean the bomb goes off, then you could kill the terrorist because you don't really have time to investigate. But anything up to imminence, there should be investigation and not killing the individual. So the Europeans are pretty, at least the elite Europeans are pretty much against the necessity standard or anything more permissive than imminence would be. Yeah, Alex.
Just a quick comment and a question about
Sure.
imminence. When you mentioned being in the sites, I knew a Marine colonel in the last Iraq War who had terrorists in the sites of his Cobra copter gunship, and they were offloading weapons into the trunk of the car, driving away with them. He knew that that was the next generation of terrorists right there, and he was ordered not to do a thing about it at the end of the war, which just really irked him, of course. But anyway, that aside, given that this is going to remain a bone of contention, because it seems to be an insoluble problem, what does that mean for the future of targeted killings? Is there a third way out between these options, or is it bound to remain a bone of contention? I think the options are going to either be some sort of compromise solution in between imminence and necessity, okay, or what philosophers call the state of nature. Okay? In other words, there won't be international legal rules regulating it. So the U.S. will get to follow whatever rules it chooses to follow, and other countries will follow whatever rules they get to follow, and there won't be any collective coordination. Now, state of nature, generally speaking, that is to say, no law regulating a situation, is generally speaking a bad idea. As you philosophy students will know from Hobbes and other philosophers, state of nature usually doesn't work all that well. Maybe a very confined state of nature regarding targeted killing wouldn't be that horrible, and in fact it may actually be what we're in now. So it could be that the alternative is going to be state of nature, no international legal rules that apply at all, although people pretend rules are applying. It's really a kind of rule-free. I think the big downside of that is it will create lots of suspicion between states that make it harder for cooperation to proceed in dealing with terrorist threats. So the Europeans, who are very strong on imminence, are very suspicious of the U.S., and that creates a certain kind of reluctance of cooperation. And the U.S. in turn thinks the Europeans, are being, too protective of terrorists. And so we're less inclined to cooperate with the Europeans on terrorist matters. So I think, so the state of nature could be what we're headed for or what we're in now, and that might mean less cooperation on terrorism than there would otherwise be, and that might mean more deaths as a result of terrorist attacks. Yeah.
I know that Rawls talks about states being rational in a sense that they're aware of their own self-interests.
Right.
And I wonder if the imminence rule and necessity rule, rather, fall under this idea of self-interest in a sense that either one could be used to justify when it would be in a state's self-interest to perform a targeted killing, if that's an umbrella or if that's kind of subsidiary of one of those two.
I would say this. Rawls does draw this distinction between states and peoples, which is a funny distinction. That is to say, it's one that's hard to sort of pin down exactly why he's doing it. So I would say this. Rationality in Rawls's theory is strictly a matter of calculations of self-interest. And bringing in the interests of others only to the extent that the interests of others serve one's own interests. Okay. Reasonableness, on the other hand, signifies a perspective from which one's own interests need to be adjusted and accommodated to meet the legitimate interests of others. Okay, so what so from the perspective of rationality, it's probably true that for the U.S., some highly permissive rule is the most rational, but it may not be the most reasonable, because it may not give sufficient weight to the interests of the citizens of other states. Okay, so so what I'm looking for is a rule that would not only be in the rational interest of this or that state, but would also be reasonable for all states and unreasonable for them to reject. And that's harder to, finding that kind of Goldilocks rule that's just right, not too hot, not too cold, but just right, is, I think, the real challenge to both law and philosophy. Yeah.
I'm not committed to this. It just popped into my head, so I'll just throw it out there and let you shoot it down. But I had the idea. Okay, so somebody might say the U.S. can't reasonably reject the imminence rule because there's already this massive power imbalance. So there's already this asymmetry between the U.S., which is really doing pretty much, I'm sure, pretty much all the targeted killings, right? I don't think many other countries are doing them. And then all the other countries, which just sort of have to play along. So really, the U.S. is furthering their geopolitical interests. They're not so much caring about their own civilian lives lost. So if they were, then they could reject reasonable. They could reasonably reject imminence, but they're not. So it's kind of a ad hoc reasoning. What do you think about that?
Well, it's certainly true that the U.S. is pursuing its own geopolitical interests, and that it is the superpower in the world today, by far. But it's also true, I think, that international law does not contain exceptions or special provisions for superpowers. In other words, international law is supposed to apply to all states. Now, there is a kind of a fiction involved in that, insofar as it abstracts from clear power differentials you're talking about. But if we're not to give up on international law, it seems to me pretty important that we stick with the idea that there aren't special rules for special states, either especially weak ones or especially strong ones, but same rules for all. I also think that it is somewhat too cynical to think, to say that the U.S. Government doesn't really care about the lives of its civilians. I think it does. And I think it weighs those lives more heavily, in fact, a lot more heavily than the lives of randomly chosen civilians outside the U.S. That's not the only thing the U.S. cares about. So it does, it cares about its, its oil companies and other, powerful actors on the U.S. scene, and not just Jane and Joe Schmo civilian. But I think it's hard to explain. It would be hard to explain the lengths to which the U.S. has gone in trying to collect intelligence about terrorism and in trying to fight against terrorism. I think you really can't explain that unless you assume that the U.S. government really is seriously interested in protecting American civilians. Yeah.
What I'm interested in knowing is basically the psychological effect of basically the terrorism. When you look at basically what the terrorists are doing as a whole, it's basically psychological warfare towards other states, or really states in general. Do these rules essentially cause a psychological effect on the whole kind of collective consciousness of a state, that they're pretty much always at the door of war? That we always have to look out for the possibility that a war could actually be there, or we're having to constantly protect ourselves, and in that sense, we cannot really focus on anything else other than our self-protection. So what does that really mean if we are actually always there?
I think the kinds of psychological effect that you are describing here are those kinds of effects are more prominent in a state like Israel than a state like the United States, which is not to say that it could not happen in the United States, or that it didn't come very close to happening in the United States in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Particularly when in the days and weeks after, when it was very unclear whether there would be follow-up attacks and what those attacks would be like. So there was a kind of siege mentality in the early days of 9/11. But I think that faded in the U.S. I think in Israel it has not faded, and in fact has intensified over the last decade or so. So it's certainly a phenomenon that, psychological phenomenon that terrorism can cause and has caused. But I don't think it's inevitable that terrorism causes that extreme level of reaction. It depends, and there are states. For example, like Pakistan, where there are a whole lot of terrorist attacks every month, every week even, and the population doesn't walk around in mortal fear. They're used to it, but they don't hide behind closed doors in order to protect themselves. And they don't have a constant siege or war mentality. Now, my guess is that major terrorist attacks in the U.S. in the future, anywhere near like 9/11, could push us very close to the kind of psychological reaction that you're speaking of, and it might. And depending on who's president, you might say, that kind of mentality may be fueled and fed and entrenched, or it might be mitigated. It might be fought against in some way. It might be watered down in some way. So I think a lot is going to depend on the political leadership in the country if and when such attacks take place.
Okay, I think we should probably wrap up here. Thank you so much. Thank you.